This is Ramiro with Anticonquista. Anticonquista is the Communist Party of the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And welcome to episode 9 of Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is a video podcast dedicated to exposing imperialist and capitalist ideology in mainstream media, especially when we're talking about Latin America, the Caribbean, and socialism. Today, the truth about Nicaragua. More specifically, we're talking about the true class nature of anti-government protest in Nicaragua. Last month marked the 1-year anniversary of protests against the Sandinista government of President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo. The protests began shortly after Ortega announced on April 16, 2018, that cuts would have to be made to Nicaragua's Social Security program. Hundreds of people were reportedly killed and injured during those protests. Along with demanding Ortega's resignation, protesters also called for what they describe as democracy, human rights, and press freedom. Here's a video that was produced by Al Jazeera English marking the anniversary. It's called Fleeing Poverty and Persecution, Nicaraguans Seek Better Lives. To me, it's a perfect example of how most mainstream media outlets covered the protest in Nicaragua. Let's take a look.
A year on from the mass protests which marked the start of the Nicaraguan crisis, and it's not just a political problem now. The country's fallen into its worst economic slump in 3 decades. Scenes like this haven't been great for attracting investment. Cristiana is one of many people laid off. One influential think tank puts it at almost 500,000. That's in a population of just 6 million people.
I've been looking for work for 8 months, not just in my area, which is publicity, but in administration, tourism, wherever I could find a job to provide for my children. But I couldn't find anything in any company. They're not hiring now. They're firing more people.
She's heading north to the US with her 3 children to look for work. More than 60,000 other Nicaraguans have already left the country. Many are in Costa Rica, saying they're fleeing persecution. Since the mass protests began, the government's clamped down on journalists and human rights groups. Vilma Núñez headed the most prominent of them, until this happened.
At 11 p.m., a group of about 60 police broke through the roof. They tied up the young man who watches the installations by his hands and feet. They took almost everything. They destroyed the organization completely, the computers, the documents. We don't know what exactly they took.
The government's entered into a dialogue with a group of business, civil society and university leaders called the Civic Alliance. But Alliance representatives themselves fear it's just a play for more time.
The dialogue is in a kind of a stalled situation. We were able to agree on 2 issues. One was the release of all the prisoners, and the second was the return to the people of Nicaragua, basic human rights and civil rights. However, the government has not been able to comply with those agreements. So far, they have shown very little compromise.
The Civic Alliance is also calling for early elections and justice for the more than 300 people reported killed and 2,000 injured. We asked both the government and other figures from the ruling party to share their views. None were available for an interview. Meanwhile, out on the streets, protests have been effectively banned and paramilitaries still roam. The government's firmly in control, but at what cost to a country that's already one of the very poorest in the hemisphere? John Holman, Al Jazeera, Managua.
Now, most recently, on Friday, May 17th of this year, the Nicaraguan opposition called for another round of protests to start. The Blue and White National Unity, a coalition of political parties and groups opposed to the current government, is organizing what it calls a nationwide civil disobedience campaign. This civil disobedience campaign is in response to the death of Eddie Montes, an opposition supporter and, interestingly enough, a former U.S. Navy member. Montes was arrested for his connection to last year's violent street protests, and on Thursday, May 16th, he was shot in prison by a guard. According to Nicaragua's Interior Ministry, Montes and other so-called political prisoners tried to snatch a gun from a guard while the International Red Cross was visiting the prison. The guard said he acted in self-defense when he shot Montes and was never instructed by the government to kill him. Despite that, the Nicaraguan opposition and the U.S. State Department have come out and blamed Ortega. That being said, we can expect to see more anti-government protests in the coming weeks. The truth about what's going on in Nicaragua is that the country is under attack by U.S. imperialism. A working-class, progressive, and anti-imperialist government is under attack by bourgeois, right-wing, and pro-imperialist forces backed by the United States. At first glance, the anti-government protests appear to possess all the traits of a popular uprising. You've got students protesting in the streets, you've got people speaking out against so-called human rights violations, and you've got people talking about overthrowing a so-called dictatorship, all while holding banners and wearing gas masks. But when we take a closer look at what's actually going on and the historical, economic, and geopolitical context of these protests, we can see that they're being used by Washington and Wall Street to overthrow the current Sandinista government led by Ortega, all in an attempt to install a right-wing, pro-US government that's subservient to its political and economic interests. Look, Nicaragua is not perfect, and neither are the Sandinistas or Ortega. But despite having to overcome centuries of Spanish colonialism and decades of US imperialism, the Sandinista government continues to make progressive gains for the country's poor. Under the Sandinistas, rates of literacy, school enrollment, life expectancy, and gross domestic product have all gone up. Meanwhile, rates of poverty, homicide, and infant mortality have all gone down. And to pretend that US-backed regime change by the Nicaraguan opposition will make things better in Nicaragua is just naive. Take Honduras, for example, which is right next door and also where my family is from. In 2009, the right-wing Honduran opposition forcibly removed democratically elected President Manuel Zelaya from power with the backing of the US. Zelaya was a progressive liberal who wanted to raise the minimum wage, create schools, improve relations with other Latin American countries, and move away from US domination. Still, Zelaya was branded a dictator much in the same way Ortega is being branded today. And the opposition tried to claim that he was cracking down on press freedom and liberty. Since Zelaya was removed and Honduras has been ruled by the right-wing National Party for almost 10 years now, it's gotten a lot worse. Homicide rates are up, poverty rates are up, social activists are constantly being killed, and involvement in drug trafficking reaches the highest levels of government. I'm talking about the president's brother being connected to drug trafficking charges. So with that in mind, can we really expect a US-backed right-wing government in Nicaragua to make things better for the Nicaraguan people? And keep in mind that most of the migrants we see fleeing Central America right now, the Central American exodus, come from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the Northern Triangle, and not Nicaragua. Doesn't that tell you something about what's actually going on in the country? Anyway, that's my opinion on the whole situation. And in order to understand the truth about what's really going on in Nicaragua, we have to take a step back and look at the overall context and situation. We have to get a better sense of the historical, geopolitical, and economic spectrum or realm within which all of this is happening. And so I'm going to go over some of that with you now. You could read some of this history in an article we published on Anticonquista called Nicaragua Protest Violence, the New Face of Imperialism. And I think this information is crucial to understanding the background of what's happening right now. Who are the players? What are their class nature? Who do they represent? because the way it's portrayed now is that the government is conservative and tyrannical, and the opposition are these freedom-loving, democracy-loving hippies, when in reality, when we look at history, it's the complete opposite. Nicaragua began like most countries in the region. A small class of wealthy criollos, the term used to describe the descendants of Spanish conquistadores and slave owners, owned a majority of the country's wealth. The mestizo, black, and indigenous people who formed the majority of the country only owned a small portion of the wealth and lived in extreme poverty. Around the mid-19th century, the US became more interested in controlling Nicaragua, not just for its cash crops like bananas and coffee, but also for its strategic geographic location. The racist imperialist concept of manifest destiny became popular across the United States, pushing white colonizers to move further west into occupied Mexican and indigenous lands to establish urban and rural settlements. At the same time, gold was found in California, attracting people and resources to the region. In the eyes of the imperialists, Nicaragua provided an ideal sea route to the US Pacific coast from the south. Only about 170 miles separate the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in southern Nicaragua, where one can easily take the San Juan River from the Caribbean Sea into Lake Nicaragua and toward the Pacific Ocean. Anticipating future US plans to construct a transoceanic canal in Panama, which was then part of Colombia, the British planned to construct a canal of their own in the region. The canal would span from their Caribbean settlement in Nicaragua, where they grew cotton, to the Pacific. However, the US imperialists managed to secure an alliance with the wealthy white Nicaraguan landowners, solidifying their control over the key trade route. The Confederates planned to ship enslaved people out of New Orleans, then the second largest port in the United States, and the fourth largest in the world, to Nicaragua. From Nicaragua, they would be shipped to California, Oregon, Washington to build infrastructure and search for gold. It would be cheaper and would require less work than having to construct new railroad lines from the south to the west. William Walker, a Confederate businessman and slave owner from Nashville, Tennessee, invaded Nicaragua with a group of US mercenaries and declared himself president on July 12, 1856. He immediately reversed the abolition of slavery in Nicaragua and even came up with plans to eventually conquer all of Central America for the Confederacy. His goal was to transform the region into a giant slave plantation. Walker was later executed in 1860 by a firing squad under the orders of Honduran General Florencio Satruch. A year later, the US Civil War began, eventually ending in 1865 with a Northern victory. The 13th Amendment was passed, formally abolishing slavery across the United States. The slave-owning Confederates, along with their dreams of a giant Central American slave plantation, were crushed. The Nicaraguan criollos who had previously allowed the Confederates to enslave their country now allied themselves with the metropolitan Yankee elites in New York City and Washington, D.C. Plans for a US-dominated interoceanic canal went nowhere, but Wall Street and the White House's grip over Nicaragua strengthened. The United States ruled Nicaragua unchallenged from the mid-1800s through the early 20th century. They invaded the Central American country at least 10 times until 1934, when anti-imperialist guerrilla leader Augusto Cesar Sandino was assassinated by the US-backed National Guard. Sandino organized armed peasant insurrections against US Marines and the National Guard in the late 20s and the early 30s. Throughout all of these invasions, the right-wing Nicaraguan criollos expressed their unrelenting support for their imperial overlords. The representatives, the far-right Somoza family, ruled without interruption from 1936 to 1979. During their time in office, they killed thousands of communists, union organizers, indigenous people, and black people. US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's touted by the First World Left as a so-called progressive, once said that Somoza may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. On July 19, 1961, a young Nicaraguan teacher, librarian, and activist named Carlos Fonseca led efforts to create the FSLN, the Frente Sandinista para la Liberación Nacional. Inspired by Cuban and Algerian revolutionaries, Fonseca and co-founders Tomás Borge and Silvio Mayorga declared war on the Somoza family dictatorship. The Sandinistas included Marxist-Leninists who admired the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba, but applied socialism to the conditions of Nicaragua, a country that's over 90% Christian and was inspired by Sandino's heroism. Fonseca, Borge, and Mayorga and their growing number of comrades soon began hosting powerful speeches and classes on socialism and guerrilla warfare in churches across the country. For over a decade, the Sandinistas recruited the most oppressed sectors of Nicaraguan society, women, campesinos, indigenous people, and black people, into their party. They also kidnapped members of Nicaragua's right-wing elite, including Somoza's soldiers, bankers, politicians, and celebrities. The Somoza dictatorship, with the financial and political backing of Washington, executed thousands of people who were thought to be associated with the Sandinistas. By 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter cut off aid to the Somozas after countless reports of their mass murders, previously brushed aside as communist propaganda, was proven to be true. By 1979, Sandinista guerrillas controlled over 90% of the country. On July 19, 1979, exactly 18 years after Fonseca, Borge, and Mayorga founded the party, the FSLN declared victory. The last Somoza in power, Anastasio Somoza de Baile, resigned and fled to Miami. U.S. President Ronald Reagan, a staunch anti-communist who took office in 1981, developed a new strategy. The strategy involved arming, training, and funding extremist right-wing groups in countries that liberated themselves from U.S. imperialism and portraying them as, quote, pro-democracy freedom fighters. Their goal was to terrorize and destabilize the country as much as possible in order to create a state of chaos. The chaos would then be blamed on the policies and ideologies of the revolutionary governments. And when the anti-imperialist governments defended themselves from the Western-backed terrorists, they were accused of abusing human rights and silencing dissent. This sneaky and deceiving strategy is part and parcel of the new face of imperialism that haunts the world today. Corporate media, of course, played a major role in bolstering this strategy. In Afghanistan, for example, the United States supported the Taliban against the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a Marxist-Leninist movement that also took power in 1979. The Taliban, a reactionary Islamic fundamentalist group that violates women's rights, were heralded as Democrats, while the communist Afghans who led the socialist government were brushed aside as tyrants and Soviet puppets. The Nicaraguan equivalents of the so-called pro-democracy Taliban fighters were the Contras, the shorthand version of the Spanish word for counter-revolutionaries. The Contras were right-wing mercenaries armed and trained by the United States in neighboring Honduras, where they planned over 1,300 terrorist attacks in Sandinista-led Nicaragua. From bombing public plazas to beheading Sandinista supporters, the Contras were known for their brutal and barbaric tactics. The Contras also served as drug runners for Colombian drug cartels, making sure cocaine produced in South America flooded the streets of the United States. Two former Nicaraguan Contras revealed in an interview with the Washington Post that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency gave them clearance in 1984 to accept airplanes and cash from a man under federal indictment on drug trafficking charges. The cocaine that was trafficked into the hoods of the United States by the Contras played a major role in dividing and destroying revolutionary Black and Latinx movements. Crack, the smokable form of cocaine, completely wrecked thousands of potential revolutionaries. Reagan and the US imperialists were, in essence, killing two birds with one stone. In 1985, Reagan referred to the Contras as, quote, the moral equal of our founding fathers. By 1990, after over a decade of US destabilization efforts in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas lost state power. Under pressure, they agreed to hold elections with a conservative opposition coalition backed by the United States, the National Opposition Union, which won the presidency. The election, however, was mired in accusations of being rigged in favor of the conservative opposition camp. Ortega, a veteran guerrillero and socialist organizer who led the country from 1979 to 1990, was removed. All of the gains the Sandinistas made within the short period of time they were in power, such as paid maternity leave, housing, food, education, and healthcare, were rolled back. In 2007, Ortega returned to power by winning the presidential election, rebranding his formerly Marxist-Leninist party as a democratic socialist and Christian movement. This occurred within the context of the Pink Tide, a term used to describe the ascendancy of social democratic and democratic socialist leaders across Latin America. Since taking back power in 2007, Ortega and the Sandinistas have slowly reintroduced the social programs they fought tooth and nail for in the past. But this has been complicated due to a tremendous amount of debt they've been cornered into paying by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Also, the conservative opposition controlled the National Assembly until 2011, obstructing countless pieces of legislation that advocated for workers, women, children, campesinos, and Black and indigenous communities. To top it off, U.S. lawmakers pushed the Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act, more commonly referred to as the NICA Act, which blocks the country from receiving loans from global institutions. In April 2019, the U.S. sanctioned Nicaragua's largest public bank in an effort to cripple its economy. Since 2007, the right-wing Nicaraguan opposition, the direct descendants of the conquistadores, the somocistas, and the contras, has tried its best to sabotage Ortega, the Sandinistas, and their plans for socialist construction. The same thing is happening in Venezuela and Bolivia against President Nicolás Maduro and President Evo Morales. Consider this: between 2014 and 2017, the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy has given $4.2 million to opposition groups in Nicaragua for the purpose of, quote, democracy promotion, aka regime change, and that's according to the organization itself. Although Nicaragua doesn't possess extremely valuable natural resources like oil and lithium, as is the case with Venezuela and Bolivia, it's situated in a strategic geographic location, not only because of its potential for a transoceanic canal, but also because it lies right in the jugular of the US-controlled Latin American cocaine trade route. Armed with money from Washington and lessons from Reagan about branding themselves as a pro-democracy opposition, they began launching new offensives just 6 years after Ortega was sworn in. In 2013, the Nicaraguan opposition infiltrated peaceful demonstrations demanding more government spending on the country's Social Security Institute, convincing people to take up arms against the Sandinistas and socialism. The protests were organized with help from the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua. However, they failed to gain momentum. A year later, when Nicaragua made plans with China to construct a transoceanic canal across the country, the opposition also held protests. This time they were done under the banner of environmentalism, even though strict restrictions were placed on environmental damages. The Nicaraguan right was perfectly content with building an interoceanic canal when the US imperialists were planning to build one. But now that Nicaragua and China are cooperating to construct one for the benefit of the global south, they're up in arms. As I mentioned earlier, the more recent and strongest opposition protests began in April 2018, when Ortega announced that small cuts would have to be made to Nicaragua's Social Security program. Not because the Sandinistas don't value social programs, but because they were avoiding economic collapse. Ortega eventually rescinded the cuts, yet right-wing violence continued. I should also mention that Ortega originally rejected the even harsher austerity plans being forced on him by the IMF. The opposition, on the other hand, demands the privatization of public services, the privatization of media, the cancellation of transoceanic canal development plans with China, and for the Sandinistas to step down from power. Conveniently, their demands match almost exactly with what the United States, the World Bank, and the IMF have been pushing for years. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and Amnesty International claims over 300 people have died as a result of the protests. They said most of those who were killed were opposition supporters, quote, at the hands of state agents. However, a separate and independent report called Dismissing the Truth, Why Amnesty International is Wrong About Nicaragua puts that figure at 253, adding that a majority of those killed were Sandinista supporters and police officers killed by the opposition. The report, published by Alliance for Global Justice and the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group in October 2018, is based on factual evidence gathered by a nonpartisan International Truth Commission, not the opposition. The Dismissing the Truth report also debunked the lie that the Nicaraguan government is torturing opposition activists. The Truth Commission investigation showed that there is no reliable evidence of such torture, and that the leader of the Human Rights Mission even confirmed this verbally on one of their visits. Finally, the report found that the opposition was purposefully editing videos in ways that made it seem like the police were initiating violence against protesters, when in fact they were just responding to direct attacks from Molotov cocktails and mortar guns. Take a look at this video produced by Canal 10 of Nicaragua, a corporate opposition news outlet. In the video, the TV presenter falsely claims police are firing at the opposition, but in the background, you can clearly see opposition protesters calmly sitting down and nothing happening.
Nos están disparando, estamos al aire y nos están disparando. Estamos resguardados, pueden ver imágenes en sus pantallas, estamos en el suelo, este es un muro corto.
She was just straight up lying. Still, news media in the West cite Canal 10 as a legitimate source for reporting on Nicaragua. Also, a lot of media outlets try to describe community collectives of Sandinista supporters defending themselves as, quote, paramilitaries, giving the impression that they were somehow under the control of the government. However, there's no evidence proving that these community collectives are under the control of the government. And in fact, Ortega and the Sandinista government have actually asked for these colectivos to not engage in violence with the opposition protesters. Independent journalists Kevin Sees and Niels McCoon also published a great report exposing the lies surrounding Western coverage of the protests. Included in their report are accounts of the brutal and gruesome tactics used by the opposition, such as lynching, that are never mentioned on television and in newspapers. They resemble the barbarian acts committed by the Contras in the 1980s. The report, however, was never circulated by any mainstream media outlet. If you want some good sources for coverage on Nicaragua, you should check out Nica Notes, Telesur, El 19 Digital, La Voz del Sandinismo, and Resumen Latinoamericano. For sources in English, I also recommend Chuck Hoffman and Dan Kovalik. So to conclude, the truth about Nicaragua is that these anti-government protests that we see popping up serve the interests of U.S. imperialism. And in fact, they represent the new face of U.S. imperialism. Using a combination of tactics, the U.S. imperialists and their Nicaraguan lapdogs are trying to convince the general public that Ortega and the Sandinistas are tyrants who need to step down. They're also trying to convince people that violent anti-government protesters and fascists are somehow pro-democracy freedom fighters who want the best for their country. It's the same tactic that's used all over the world against leaders who refuse to bow down to the wealthy Western global establishment, like Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Yes, there are problems in Nicaragua, but Ortega and the Sandinistas are the first ones to point them out and to show that they're working alongside the Nicaraguan people to fix them. But to pretend that U.S. imperialism and modern-day Contras dressed up as hipsters and protesters will fix these problems is just insane. So next time someone repeats the same mainstream media narrative about the anti-government protests in Nicaragua, keep in mind all of this historical context, because you're definitely not going to hear it from places like Vice, Al Jazeera, or any other corporate news outlet. So that's all for today. Thanks for listening and watching. This was episode 9 of Decolonizing Media for Anticonquista. Anticonquista is the Communist Party of the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and IG at Anticonquista, and subscribe to us on YouTube, youtube.com/Anticonquista. And you can listen to an audio version of this podcast on SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/Anticonquista. Thanks again, and we hope to hear from you soon.